Next, I'd like to invite up Scott Morrison, Dr. Scott Morrison, who's the Director of Conservation Programs and Science for the Nature Conservancy's California chapter. Scott is an amazing big picture thinker, and there's no one better to take this last talk of the day. He's kind of like the island Yoda as far as I'm concerned. He will describe the importance of island collaborations and the path forward for the archipelago. Thanks.
So does that mean I get my nouns and verbs kind of mixed up? It was like, so, it's good? So clearly, by virtue of us all being here, there is something about islands that just captures the imagination. And they certainly held the imagination of the earlymost European explorers as they were working their way up the west coast of North America in the 1500s and 1600s. And among the things that they were looking for was the Garden of Eden, where the hand of God reached down and created Adam and Eve. And they presumed that that paradise on earth was going to be an island. And they so wanted to find an island, they convinced themselves that's what they found. The idea of California as an island soon became established fact, and it was passed down for generations. In fact, it was passed down for centuries. Only over time, the very different California was finally discovered, the one that all along had been hidden in plain sight. Now, that history is instructive when examining the state of knowledge regarding the natural and cultural history of the real islands off the coast of Alta and Baja California. Because even though these islands are now so familiar, or seem so, they actually hold a lot of mystery. And there is a lot yet to be discovered or rediscovered about them. And one of the things I want to talk about in this talk is how these islands can help us discover how to do conservation better. We're in an era where conservation decision-making is just going to get harder and harder, and the world needs demonstrated solutions. But first, how can it be that these islands, so near so many premier research and natural history institutions, have remained so mysterious? Well, that is in part because so much of their history has been erased. Introduced herbivores had a devastating impact on the California islands, and pretty much all the biological surveys, all the observational records we have of these places came only after the islands had already been highly altered like this. So what were the islands like before all this? And it's not just for curiosity's sake that we ask and want to know. To manage the island's ecosystems into the future, we need to understand what they were before all this happened, long before. Now, going back to those early European explorers, another of their great failures in observation was their failure to recognize the fellow human beings that were already there. For thousands of years, these islands were home to thousands of people with rich and thriving cultures and economies, and they were shaping the ecosystems of which they were part. So, of course, another reason for the gap in our understanding of the deep past of these places is because of the systematic effort to sever that intergenerational continuity of the first stewards of the islands and the islands themselves. Now, despite that effort, fortunately, those connections remain strong, and the descendants, and those connections are fortifying. And the reawakening of that history clearly has an importance that transcends just conservation, but it also has a true value for conservation because we do need to understand what these islands were in order to take care of them. Now, to illustrate just how basic the gaps are in our knowledge of this history, here we have the island scrub jay. This is the only place on the planet you will find one. But why is that? The genetics of this species suggest that it's been out there for 1 million years. And yet just 10,000 years ago, when sea levels were lower, these islands were all connected as one landmass. So why, in just that short amount of time, did it only end up here and not 6 miles away? Did it disappear from Santa Rosa Island thousands of years ago, or just in the past couple hundred? This expanse of Santa Rosa Island was probably once dense oak chaparral, vegetation that would have been able to support jays. Intensive sheep ranching in the late 1800s devastated everything that you see in this frame. So was that the culprit behind the disappearance of the jay? The fact is, we don't know. But this question of why jays are only on Santa Cruz Island is highly relevant to their conservation. Being isolated on a single island makes the species much more vulnerable to catastrophic events like wildfire and disease. And both of those threats are exacerbated by climate change. Now, if we had jays on multiple islands, the species overall would have a much lower risk of extinction. So should we move the jay back to where we know it once was? How would we decide that one way or the other? Now, conservation these days is filled with questions like that. And islands can be the laboratories for developing smart ways of answering those kinds of questions. Islands are renowned as places of discovery because they are relatively simple, bounded systems. They are places where it's easier to figure out the way the world works. We all know how important islands were in the discovery of natural selection. Insights from islands also became the theory underpinning the entire field of conservation biology, helping us understand what happens when natural habitat is reduced to being an island surrounded by human land uses. Now, as a conservation practitioner, I find myself drawn to islands for a number of reasons. First and foremost, they are hotspots of endemism and imperilment. So they are ground zero for confronting the global mass extinction crisis. We, as conservationists, have to be successful on islands. Full stop. Islands are also relatively small, discrete management units, so there's often a more kind of straightforward management prerogative that we have on islands to take action. And you can also take actions on islands with a higher degree of confidence of success than you might have on more mainland systems. So, for example, the pest eradications that we've seen here. I personally really like how having clear accountability for the fate of a species sharpens the attention. It can make theoretical conservation debates get real fast. But in my role now, what I most value about working on islands is how they can be model systems for figuring out how to increase the pace, scale, and effectiveness of conservation more generally. Unless that sounds kind of abstract or intimidating with Darwin himself staring down on us. The first step in developing a model is simply remembering to step up kind of out of the details of your particular system, out of your particular question, to ask why somebody who doesn't care about your focal study organism or care about the California islands should care about the problem you're trying to solve. And when you figured that out, why what you're doing might be relevant to other scientists or managers out there, then you think about how to design and communicate your work so that you can reach and inform those people. And the specific thing you're working on then is an application or a test of your potential model. With that mindset, you are now developing a solution to a problem that others also have, meaning that you're not just delivering an important local impact, you're also increasing the ability of others somewhere else to advance their own conservation efforts. And there is so much work on our islands here that can be done with a model development mindset. Most people underestimate this, but probably the hardest part of conservation in the century ahead that conservationists are facing the world over is making sure that the precious few places in the world that we have protected for nature, whether they're on islands or mainlands, actually function to retain the biodiversity that most need those places. Because anymore, if places are not actively managed, they will degrade, and the things that were special about them will be lost. But invariably, we in conservation don't have enough funds or capacity to do everything that needs to be done everywhere. So we have to figure out which subset of biodiversity will be the priority for management on a given preserve. And we need frameworks for figuring that out. We need models for how to do that. And all of our collective work on the California islands provide no shortage of impetuses and opportunities to figure out those frameworks. As an example of a problem that conservationists need to get much more facile dealing with, consider climate change adaptation. We know that rapid climate change is going to give all species 3 options. Move to track the climate that you need, adapt in place, or go extinct. But if you're an island species with a limited dispersal ability, one option might be off the table. You might not be able to track the climate that you need if it moves away from the island that you're on. You're stuck unless somebody helps you along the way. Like somebody mentioned job security here. If you want conservation job security for the century ahead, get proficient in the science and practice of conservation translocations. We will need it everywhere. Just think of all the mainland species that will be dispersal limited because their habitat is fragmented. Now, one of the reasons why folks in this island community might be especially well equipped to think through how best to do conservation translocations responsibly is that many of us have just spent decades trying to get things off of islands and places where they very much did not belong. We in the island community know well the mess that can result when things are put in the wrong places. So we know to use real humility about moving things ourselves. But importantly, we are also a courageous and action-oriented bunch, and that's because we know how impatient extinction can be on islands. So, what if a rare plant is having trouble persisting on an island? Should it be moved to a neighboring island where it currently doesn't occur? Would the way we think that through be the same if we were considering a species from elsewhere in the world that might be similarly threatened and the California Islands can provide it a safe place to live? Some species of albatross in the Pacific breed mostly on low-lying atolls, highly vulnerable to sea level rise. Conservation planners have identified the California Channel Islands as a place that could provide more climate-resilient options for the birds. So should a manager facilitate the colonization of this species onto one of these islands? What if establishing a breeding colony could potentially down the line adversely affect a local endemic plant? What's the framework you use to make those decisions? Would you use the same framework to evaluate these 2 scenarios? What about species that are already here? What if you have a species that was introduced from the mainland and now it is spreading rapidly? It's not native, but having it on the island might actually benefit its regional conservation. What about a species that shows up on its own and is spreading? Colonization, after all, is a fundamental biogeographic process on islands. So what should get to stay? What should we manage? What should we remove? How would we decide? Is there any overarching kind of philosophy that could be applied here? Or are these all just one-off decisions? And then for those species that we decide are just going to have to adapt in place and deal with climate-exacerbated threats, how interventionist should we be in helping them? Is vaccinating a wild population from now until forever the right thing to do? Remember that extinction as well is also a fundamental biogeographic process on islands. There are now very active frontiers in synthetic biology focusing on genetic manipulation that can make species more disease resistant or drought or heat tolerant. And there are increasing calls to apply these advances in the service of conservation. Should we consider using these tools on our islands? For example, genetically manipulated organisms might be the only way to eradicate pests like mice from Isla Guadalupe or rats from a place like San Miguel Island. So when these tools become technologically feasible, should they be considered on our islands? Again, why or why not? The point of this smattering of questions is to highlight how the islands are not just hotspots of endemism, they are also hotspots of high-stakes decision-making. How hands-on or hands-off should we be? What do we want these islands to look like 100 years from now? And how should we make these decisions? Going into the future where everything is going to be resorting, should we be making these decisions species by species, island by island, manager by manager? Or should we have some sort of overarching framework to guide these decisions across the archipelago? We need to figure this out because we're seeing it already, how island managers are becoming increasingly reliant on what happens on other islands in order to preserve the biodiversity across the system. We're also going to be increasingly seeing interchange between islands and the mainland, creating mainland refugia for island plants, for example. Would we also consider creating island refugia for mainland plants? I don't know. The truth behind all of these what ifs and headlines like you see in your newsfeed every day is that we can't save it all. We don't have the resources for it, and it wouldn't be possible anyway. So, what will we prioritize for protection? Knowing that what we choose not to prioritize, we could lose. I remember back in the heat of the feral pig eradication on Santa Cruz Island, we were getting a ton of blowback from in the media and in the courts, and people opposed to the project would accuse us of just playing God out there. And we'd say, no, we're not playing God. We're simply taking things off the island that don't belong. Today, though, given what we know about the severity and the urgency of the global biodiversity crisis, I'd probably respond to that accusation a little differently. Today, I would say, you're right. We are playing God. And that's because as conservationists in this human-dominated world, we have to. It's our job. In this era of mass extinction and global change and always scarce resources, we have to pick winners and losers. We have to decide whether to move species that can't move themselves. We have to decide whether to use modern technologies to change them. And we have to accept the consequences if we decide not to decide. Given the ecological mess that we've made in the world with invasive species and climate change, just letting nature take its course doesn't cut it anymore. It won't go back to what it once was, and it will take us somewhere altogether novel, and we will lose some of the things that we get to share the world with that make it special. So make no mistake, through our actions as well as through our inactions, conservation anymore is the business of playing God. And given that, we all better get really good at it. And getting good at it means figuring out how to do it responsibly. And that means being clear about the values we use to underpin our decisions. It means using best available science. It means using structured and robust and transparent and documented decision-making processes. It means giving proper consideration to risks, to costs, to opportunity costs, and to trade-offs. That's what rising to this awesome responsibility of this global moment means. And these are the landscapes of discovery for us to figure out how to do that. Conservation on these islands cuts to the very core of what conservation requires in today's world. The questions we grapple with on these islands routinely are foundational conservation questions, foundational ecological questions, philosophical questions, legal and policy questions. They're foundational ethical questions. They're even foundational spiritual questions. Why do individual species matter? What lengths should we go to protect them? What are these islands for? Who are these islands for? Which plants and animals do we really want to make sure future generations get to share their world with? There is no better training ground to develop the proficiencies in conservation decision-making we will need in the century ahead than these islands of the Californias. And that is because We have the momentum of decades of conservation leadership and accomplishment to build from. You know, there's one more ingredient to navigating this new era of conservation decision-making if we want to do it responsibly, and we've heard it in every one of these talks, and that is that we have to do it collaboratively. We can only do this together. The conservation story of the islands thus far is a story of what we can accomplish in partnership with all of us in our different roles and expertises, with all of our different perspectives being brought to bear. All the conservation and restoration success stories we hear about these islands, the inspiring story of the island fox recovery, yes, these are stories of science and of ingenuity and of determination, but more than anything else, they are stories of the essentialness, the power, and the hopefulness of collaboration. Indeed, the collaborative enterprise that we have collectively built on these islands is a model in and of itself. So for those of you already working in this system, thank you. Your work is giving nature out there a fighting chance that it's going to need for what's ahead. For those of you wanting to make a difference in conservation, come on in. The islands need you because we have got to get this next phase right. And by helping us develop approaches to conservation that others elsewhere can also apply, your work will surely have an influence far beyond. There is indeed something about islands that conjures the imagination. Thank you for bringing your creativity, your passion, your smarts, your initiative to them, and for meeting us on one of the most exciting frontiers in conservation, and that's the one just offshore. Thank you very much.